you.
Thanks, Louise. It's not so easy to walk around like it was yesterday. So I'd like to welcome Yasser, who is now on his way to prepare his slides. Yasser Bhatti is an honorary lecturer at the Imperial College London. He is also a lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. And he's going to present a paper that actually encapsulates what he has written along with his co-authors Basu, Baron, and Ventresca. And that's the book Frugal Innovation Models, Means, and Methods. You have this flyer right next to you, right on your desk. And yeah, welcome, Yasser.
So like Louise, I reshuffled my slides at 2:30 a.m. this morning. but hopefully it will be useful to you, based on what we heard yesterday, and I thought I'd touch upon some of the things that we were discussing, as well as I perceived based on the case studies that you have done. So let's see, and ask any questions, please. You're a small audience, so I don't want to make this too formal. Just one-way transmission. So, so frugal innovation. We've spoken about it, and we've discussed it in terms of many other concepts. But I thought I'd share with you how I view this, having read about this literature and contributed to it for almost a decade. So I think broadly people are studying this from, for instance, the social entrepreneurial perspective, in terms of, there's huge populations of underserved communities, and for different reasons, maybe the public sector isn't able to provide for them, or the free market economy isn't attracted enough in terms of profitability to address those needs. And so social entrepreneurs are doing this primarily to serve needs which would be considered as quite basic. And then there's this perspective of global strategy in frugal innovation, as you saw the growth of emerging markets and growth of companies and corporations from these emerging markets, and so existing companies needing to compete with those companies like Tata and Haier in China and from Brazil. And if they don't do so, then in the next century or this century, they're going to lose out this competitive war. And then there's, within design and engineering, you've heard of concepts like frugal engineering. Perhaps they're using concepts from the Japanese TQM models of eliminating waste, Muda, making it more lean. And then within operations management, there's an interest to basically optimize, to increase efficiency, remove redundant activities and processes, like that what do they used to call that? Re-engineering or reprocess development, which was a big buzzword in the 1990s. And then finally, but not at all any less in terms of priority, but sustainability. So people are talking about frugal innovation as a means to address sustainability concerns, climate change, how to meet the SDGs by the UN. So you can see there's lots of different communities talking about this concept and fitting it in within what their purpose is. I essentially situate my work primarily on the social entrepreneurial domain, as well as the strategy domain. So how companies can benefit from being perhaps more socially oriented. So within those two domains of entrepreneurship and strategy, we've coming up with this book with my co-authors. Some pretty heavyweights, as Radha Basu, you might know, was the founder of the Frugal Innovation Lab at Santa Clara University. She's famously known for the 10 core competencies needed for engineering in the developing world. And then, my supervisors and my mentors and colleagues at Oxford who helped me do all of this research. So to kind of see what the two broad theoretical fields that we draw upon in terms of the literature, so we're looking at activities in unusual contexts. So these unusual contexts might be least developing countries, or they might be pockets in developed countries which, historically, for whatever reason, have those kind of inequalities that Madeline was talking about yesterday. But they're not being addressed even in some developed countries. So theoretically, we see this as drawing upon resource-based theories and acknowledging that these contexts will be facing some sort of scarce resources, either to innovate, to feed into the innovation process, or to be able to afford the outcomes of those innovation activities. And then the second literature, the theories that we draw upon are institutional theory and the idea that in certain areas you might have less developed institutions that we often consider, as compared to the kind of institutions we consider as necessary for a well-functioning free market economy. But then, there's this also notion that, yes, there might be some voids, but then there might be complex institutions in different environments. So different kinds of institutions from the ones that maybe we are accustomed to. So culture, for instance, is a big one, right? And then to give you an idea of, what were the primary research questions we were looking at that underpin this study. So again, two main literature streams. One, innovation, of course, and then the other is social enterprise. So in social entrepreneurship literature, there is this idea which is, has some evidence behind it, but when we first started this work, mostly there wasn't so much empirical evidence around this argument that the kind of innovation that social entrepreneurs do is social innovation. And then if you look at the literature in social innovation, again, just like frugal innovation, nobody really comes to terms with, okay, what is social innovation and how do we identify that it's happening? How do we evaluate it? There's still lots and lots of studies are going on around how to actually measure, evaluate the impact of social innovation. And Madeline would know a lot about this based on her expertise. So we were essentially challenging this idea that what social entrepreneurs do is social innovation. So what do they actually do, or how do they perceive their activities in their unique contexts, marked by resource constraints and institutional voids? So the first research question was fundamentally, how do these social entrepreneurs view or perceive innovation in terms of what they're doing or what they see others doing? And then the second research question, extend that a little bit further, was, okay, how do they view innovation, particularly under resource constraints? And then extend that a little bit further, and then the third question was, how do these social entrepreneurs view or perceive innovation under institutional voids? And then we package all of that together, and it hopefully gives us a better understanding of both the kinds of innovations they do or they perceive others doing, and particularly in those contexts marked by constraints. So how did we go about doing this? We went to, you have to be pragmatic as well about your research. So we went to two communities that convene every year in Silicon Valley of all places around the world. But they're very structured programs at Stanford called the Design for Extreme Affordability program. So for instance, the Embrace baby warmer that you were exposed to yesterday, that is one of the most successful projects that came out of Design for Extreme Affordability. Then the Social Business Incubator at Santa Clara University. So when we did this empirical study, the kind of impact the Social Business Incubator had around the world was almost 200-300 billion. by the end of the decade, they wanted to increase this to 1 billion. So what they do is they have a sort of like an application process whereby they invite successful social entrepreneurs addressing basic needs from in and from around the world, and they invite them for a very structured program to an accelerator, if you say, to expose them to Silicon Valley mentors and professionals and help them to scale up their operations even beyond what they've achieved. So, the question of scalability that we're looking at. So we went to these localities because it would be a place where we would find a concentration of social entrepreneurs who were vetted as such, either because they had gone through the application process or had been acknowledged through other awards and prizes. So we did a bunch of document analysis, interviews, and observations. So what did we find? Okay, so the main thing that what we want to share here, the main lessons from this 300-page book. So one thing was certainly that there were varying motivations that these entrepreneurs were sharing with us. At a very basic level, again, one was user-driven innovation. So Von Hippel's work around just essentially grassroots users getting involved in innovation activity because they want to fulfill their personal need or a need that they have an association with in their locality. So this is, for instance, an Israeli entrepreneur innovator who came up with a disposable bicycle made out of recycled cardboard and in his garage. And what the claim by The Economist was that it's about $10 a piece and doesn't hurt the environment at all. And then, the very famous example, again, we saw this yesterday, the GE Mac 400. And why is GE doing this? Yes, overtly they're saying we're doing this because we want to bring healthcare to the marginalized or the underserved, but actually behind, and underpinning their strategy is that they want to take advantage of their R&D centers in those new emerging markets to become more efficient because, well, it's cheaper to do R&D there, and now you've got this brilliant workforce in India or China or Brazil. Why not tap that expertise to address the local needs and the local markets? But in the bigger picture, it's really about frugal engineering and becoming more competitive globally for them. And then we know the examples of Grameen Bank, microfinance, Muhammad Yunus. So these are the famous social entrepreneurs that we look up to. But their primary motive or reason why they're doing these activities is because they want to make a difference in the world. They want to give back to society more than what perhaps they take from it in terms of profits and revenues. And then the fourth one, interestingly, was this challenge-driven innovation. So you've heard of maybe the $300 house. This was triggered by back in 2011 or 12, a competition kind of thing. And there's similar activities, such as the X Prize, to try and make space travel much more affordable to the masses. So instead of having to pay £2 million to the Russian Space Agency to get a ride into orbit, now you've got plenty of Virgin Galactic and other SpaceX companies which can do this for as little as £100,000. So, but these people were getting together in networks and of designers and investors and to basically overcome a challenge, a long, established notion that this is something unaffordable. So how can we make it certainly affordable for everyone? And then, so based on this, these different variations of needs or motivations, then you could come, we discussed, okay, what is the definition of frugal innovation? And again, I think like every other domain, like social entrepreneurship, I don't think we're ever going to agree on one or a couple of definitions of frugal innovation. And even in this work, we sort of exemplify, depending on what your perspective is, you can have a plethora of definitions. And you essentially adopt the one that fits your requirements and needs and your purpose. So if you're user-driven, then frugal innovation, based on that, is generating solutions to local or personal needs otherwise not met. If you're efficiency-driven, then you are trying to achieve cost leadership as a competitive advantage, often globally. If you're social-driven, you are doing this to solve problems and create value for society. If you're challenge-driven, you want to perhaps radically improve some price-performance dimension, which is unfeasible for existing customers. So, and then if you step even beyond that, look at it theoretically, well, you could have an institutional perspective, which is perhaps that frugal innovation is a new way of thinking how we do international development. This was something that Paul, I think, was talking about yesterday, that field has changed. If you look at it from the process view, then it might be the kinds of things that we talk about, set of tasks or actions to redesign products and services and reconfigure value chains. This is the kind of stuff that we say, let's take out the extra features which 90% of the population doesn't use and just bring down the offering to its basic core level. And then, and functionally, again, as I said in the previous one, it could be based on what needs you're addressing. I mean, if they're social needs or if they're efficiency-related needs, then you could have that perspective. But if you really wanted to perhaps operationalize this, these different perspectives, theoretical and conceptual, if you want to operationalize it, then based on the literature, you've seen some people say, well, it's doing more with less. Some people are saying it's about doing more for more people. Some people are saying that it's doing it better with less. But all of those different perspectives, maybe if you compile them, then operationally and simplistically speaking, frugal innovation is about means and ends to do more with less for many. And so when we break that definition down, we essentially show that there are three main aspects or dimensions by which you can then further operationalize frugal innovation. And we've used this understanding to, for instance, develop toolkits to identify frugal innovation. So a set of 10 questions that we've used extensively in our research when we scanned and looked for innovations around the world. So it's about adaptability. Depending on the local needs, do you need to provide something that's just good enough, just as good, or better than the current incumbent offerings? It's certainly about affordability. Is it about the fact that you want for more people to be able to buy this, or is it that you want to make it available to other innovators and entrepreneurs to freely innovate on top of it? The notion of crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, and open source platforms, maker movement, just let people innovate. And then it's of course about accessibility, because based on Prahalad's original work around bottom of the pyramid, we have to acknowledge there's 4 billion people, as Jagdeep was saying, around the world that don't have the kinds of things that we take for granted, and we need to make these things accessible to them, to the masses. So it's, as you were saying, the question of scalability. So that's about what, I think in terms of definitions that you could really basically use any of those definitions or range of different definitions to suit your purpose. And maybe that's the power of frugal innovation or even innovation itself, because even after now a century of studies in innovation after Schumpeter, yes, you can have a plethora of different definitions for innovation. So then, moving on to certain frameworks. As I said, the book is about models and frameworks. So this is, let's see, am I okay on time? All right.
Yeah, it's still fine. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm pretty much halfway through, but hopefully.
Okay, just keep going.
So this is sort of like assumption or hypothesis I had before I went into the field. We had read the literature, looked at examples, and so you see here that two dimensions. If you want to spend very little money on a product or service, then common sense will make you believe that you're going to have to bear or have to deal with the low quality of that offering. That is going to end up being very cheap. If it's a cheap product, then it's going to be low quality. Breakdown is fairly good. If, on the other hand, you expect high performance, high quality, then common sense again will make you believe that you should be willing and able to pay for that high performance. So expensive or luxury or But frugal innovators, on the other hand, I thought that perhaps what they're really trying to do is they're challenging themselves to say, well, why do we have to accept this long-held notion that cheap is low quality and expensive is high quality? Why can we not perhaps offer very, very cheap offerings at that same very high level quality that only a few can afford, as Madeline again was saying yesterday, instead of just innovating for the rich, can we innovate equally well for everybody else? And that was the sort of assumption that I had before I went into the field. And thankfully so, of the many innovations that I encountered, this one I think exemplifies how this actually holds true. So this is sometimes called the Jaipur knee, or now it's called the Remotion knee. And in 2009 it was awarded this recognition of being one of the 50 best inventions by Time magazine. So so what these people did was, if you've heard of the Jaipur knee, in India there is an NGO called Jaipur Foot who has for many decades been equipping people with above knee prosthetics. And they had a pretty flimsy device that they were using. And they invited Stanford-based MSc students to help them redesign that device. So you see, this is a little video of that original device that they've long been using for many, many decades. And it's very hard for this person to walk freely with that knee prosthetic. So, and why is that so difficult? Because walking is actually a much more flexible movement. It involves complex 360-degree movements and balancing. And this is the replacement device that they came up with. And this gentleman is just trying it out for the first time. And you can see comparatively he's walking much more comfortably. So instead of having a single axis device, which is this one here, that has limited movement, and for instance, this would not be able to bend a full 180 degrees. And as you can see, we can bend our knee pretty much 180 degrees. I'm talking about adaptability and needs for the local environment. Have you noticed how the infrastructure in the Asian countries is very different from the kinds of toilet infrastructure we have here? People have traveled to that part, and even to, I'm sure, in Africa largely, right? I mean, in that part we call it an Asian toilet. But it essentially means that you squat on the floor. And when you're squatting, just imagine, you're putting a lot of pressure on your knee right there, and you're sitting in that movement for however long you need to. And if you were wearing that cheap knee joint, then it's virtually not possible for you to do that. And you're talking about people who are living on what, less than $1 a day, and they can't even afford, basic necessities, and you're going to expect them maybe to buy a Western toilet flush so that they can be able to do their everyday stuff. And their everyday stuff involves sitting on the floor. In the Asian culture, you sit on the floor, you eat, you play, you work. Students, you might have seen pictures of kids there in schools just sitting on the floor and working. And I see that more and more happening in the schools here as well. When I go to my daughter's school and I see teachers just basically having them sit on the floor on the carpet. That's wonderful. We're coming down more to our basics. So, but that gives you an example of how that you can often overlook this very basic need and of our daily practices and then not redesign our products to conform to that. So going back to this model, you see here we've got low cost, low performance, single access knee joint, which the NGO was using for many years. And then on the other hand, you've got these very expensive, sophisticated, complex, titanium reinforced microchip, devices, which are probably only affordable by the U.S. military, for instance, for their veterans. So these engineers go in and say, well, can we come up with something that's much more affordable, but also as high performance? And they come up with this polycentric knee device, a cost of $20. And currently, we state in the book, with having updated our information, that this company is now selling it at $80 a piece. Still very, very cheap compared to the high end. So looking at this, I said, well, so this is the hypothesis I had, and this is a diagram that the company shared with me, right? It's copyrighted by them. It's not something I created. And it nicely overlays with the assumption we had initially before we went out into the field. That's great. That's amazing. That actually lends support to some of the initial assumptions we had about frugal innovation. And then further thinking about this in terms of disruptive technology, you must have heard of this concept from Clayton Christensen, very popular, based on analysis of hard drive industry in the United States. But then does disruptive, so what's the similarity or relationship of disruptive innovation to frugal innovation? Is it the same? Is it different? Well, in this disruptive innovation, what you essentially have is that you've got the incumbent technology, which is quite high performance because it's had many, many years of improvement, incremental innovation. But because you keep adding stuff to it incrementally, more and more features, it becomes only available and affordable by the wealthier people. And this is what, again, we were discussing yesterday, why does innovation just have to be concentrated as looking at the needs of the wealthy? But then somewhere along the line, like Christensen says, that new technology comes in, which would be disruptive. But when that new technology comes into the market, it's often of less performance, lower performance than the existing one. And it takes time for the new, radical, disruptive, transformative, call it whatever, technology, it takes it time before it reaches the same performance levels of the incumbent. So that's the underlying argument in disruptive technology. But then the question arises, does this hold true for frugal innovations? So, and I would say as food for thought that maybe frugal innovation as compared to disruptive innovation is again better situated up here at high performance. Disruptive is again about just good enough to attract your customers, get a foot into the market, and over time you will improve it and catch up with the existing offering. But frugal innovators are essentially, again, remember, they're challenging themselves to say, as soon as we make it available to the market, we're going to say, look, this is as good or even better than what you're using, and at a fraction of the cost. So they're trying to accelerate this process of disruptive innovation, in other words, to essentially do it much more rapidly. So that's one way I think we can look at how frugal might be different from disruptive. And this is even more important in healthcare. There are arguably, maybe in education, maybe in finance, you might be able to offer something that's good enough just to get you started. Of course, having something is better than not having anything. But in healthcare, that argument doesn't hold true. In healthcare, it's about, those are the values that we espouse here in the NHS, that the same level of service should be provided to anyone, regardless of their ability to pay in healthcare. There's no second best in healthcare provision. Even if you're giving it out as a charity or donation, it has to be as good as the existing one. But then coming back to innovation literature, this is a very technology-centric view of all these models. The disruptive innovation model is based on technology. We've learned a lot from it, but then when you're going into these unique contexts where, or extreme environments where maybe technology is not even available, and then, remember, the institutions are very complex. So what we found was that frugal innovation cannot just be seen as a technological innovation. Yes, again, some of you were saying yesterday, oh, but you're giving us a very product-centric view. It's all about technology. What about society? What about norms, behaviors, our expectations? So that's about the social side of innovation. But in addition to how we behave in society, what governs our behavior? It's the different institutions that set the rules on what you can do and cannot do, who can play and who wins or loses, right? So the institutional context, again, has to be taken into account. And a lot of these innovators we're finding, actually frugal innovators, as I said, because they want to accelerate this pace of innovation activity towards being able to offer a substitute or alternative at a fraction of the cost, often you'll see that they are recombining existing components, off-the-shelf components, again, as Jaideep was saying yesterday, and packaging them together into a new form. So that's the extent to which the technological innovation is happening, by and large. But they're really changing society. They're either providing something that society really, really wants, or in the process they're actually changing how society functions. There may be mobile phones, and mobile phone banking. But at the same time, they're facing some very, very complicated institutions, which can either be conducive to the kind of innovation they're doing, or be very difficult. So for instance, one of the innovations I studied was banana bags. This was providing for schoolgirls provision for menstruation pads, and they were made out of banana leaves. And the main challenge they had was not the technological challenge of coming up with the pads and selling them, but the main challenge was how do they change the mindset in those communities so that it was acceptable for the girls and women to actually freely go out and buy and make these pads or sell them in the process. So it was about advocacy, a lot about something you're talking about in your two projects here as well. There's nothing new about the shoes you're selling. Maybe there's nothing new about the antiretroviral drugs that you're selling. But it's about creating awareness in the community so that it becomes much more acceptable. So you are challenging the existing cultural norms and institutions so that they are much more much more compatible with the kind of technology that you're offering. So while these innovators are trying to innovate on the technology front, the social front, and the institutional front, that's really very hard to do. Trying to do all these three things is very, very difficult, which is one reason perhaps we're finding that frugal innovation success stories haven't really been around that much. Only a few, maybe handful. So these lessons have been learned over and over again. So for instance, this is the incubator, and many people have been trying to redesign the incubator for low resource settings. And these folks at MIT Poverty Lab wrote their lessons, lessons learned from the failure of their incubator. And they essentially said it was not sufficient for us just to design for the end user. That's the extent to the technology that they were doing. They needed to design for the whole system, the whole context, because their vested interest, again, Louise talked about these, right? I mean, there's some existing power structures, vested interests, people don't like change, and how are you going to be able to incentivize all those different players so that they don't cause obstruction to the adoption of that frugal innovation? And we're finding this in many of the innovations that we're trying to now help facilitate. So that's basically the frameworks, insights, and the main lessons that we covered in the book, using many cases and examples. We provide some toolkits for researchers, as I said, to identify innovations and put them into practice, as Radha Basu stand for competencies. So that's a summary of the book's content. I hope that's useful in terms of the whole research that you're doing as well, to frame it and justify your approach. So that's that's where I am, and I think I've run out of time. What I had in the back of my pocket was how are we actually using these frameworks in real practice. So it's up to the chair if you want me to do that. But essentially, we've been using these tools for the last 4 years to try and find innovations from around the world that can help the NHS to become more efficient. And we've got a couple of innovations currently that we are very close to having introduced into the NHS Northwest London hospitals. Okay, that's all right. So one of them. So we published about our scouting methodology, and one of them, is well, let me just quickly go. So we looked for thousands. We looked at thousands of innovations based on secondary sources and primary data collection. We published about it in these 2 papers, and the 5 innovations that we did case studies on were these ones from Mexico, India, Kenya, Brazil, and Singapore. And I thought this was useful for our friends from Macquarie University, because I think the next step you guys want to do is to understand how you can compare your different case studies. So we had a template, we had a template in the beginning to come to terms on what case studies we were doing. And then once we had done them, we used these different evaluations to cross-compare the different cases. And we can see the core feature, the underlying feature of these innovations ranges from using telemedicine, lean processes, maybe task shifting from doctors to community health workers, or empowerment of the community so they look after their own health care. But a lot of these are all care delivery models. So beyond care delivery models, we said, strangely enough, the 2 most popular frugal innovations talked about in the literature are surgical. The Aravind eye cataract surgery at $25, and Narayana's $800 cardiac surgery. We've beaten those cases to death. So then we said, okay, now we have this huge database of innovations. Can we find stuff that's surgical? And maybe, surgical innovations, because they're device-oriented or product-oriented, we might have a slightly better chance of introducing them into the NHS. So we looked for these surgical innovations. Here's our field trips to Entebbe, Uganda, to Tanzania, to Kenya, and we found this device. Amazing little piece of kit. So basically what this is, and we documented it in our case study, again to convince clinicians that it was as good as the incumbent. So what orthopedic surgeons do is they use this autoclavable surgical drill. And this surgical drill is different because you can essentially put this into an autoclave and cook it at 130 degrees for half an hour. Including the battery, you can put it in the autoclave, and it will still work. But this company, or these couple of main companies that sell this device, sell it for almost $30,000 US or 23,000 pounds. Often donated to the low-income settings. When they break down, you can't even replace or fix them. Okay? Because this thing is all sealed back. You can't even open the thing. There's no screws or anything. On the other hand, what we found, including one of our PhD students who only just graduated last year, who's an orthopedic surgeon, when he went on an exchange fellowship, the kind that FET sponsors, he went to Malawi and he saw this practice where local surgeons were using off-the-shelf, remember off-the-shelf components, existing technologies and frugal innovation? They were using this stuff that you just went out and bought from a hardware store. And these drills have the same performance metrics and actually in some ways are even better. They last longer, their batteries last longer, they're easy to repair, and they're ergonomically even better to use because these are sold like in the millions around the world, whereas these are probably sold in the thousands, let's say.
How much are those?
Oh, you can buy as little as 40 pounds from here too. But ergonomically, really, you know, when we tested these with the surgeons, they were like, oh, this stuff, I use it in my home all the time, you know, to put up picture frames put together a shelf. And they're nice to use. They've got a nice light at the end, LED light, which helps you focus. I mean, it's like a no-brainer. So these surgeons in Africa, and Malawi, and Uganda, and Malago Hospital, actually, they're just covering the device with a sterile, you know, homemade cover. And as long as the bit that they insert into the device is sterile, they're managing. But of course, there is still a risk involved, right? Because you're not packaging it in fully sealed manner. So these engineers from Scrubs program at the University of British Columbia went to Malago Hospital on an exchange program visit and saw this practice and said, oh, why don't we use our engineering prowess that we've learned and skills and actually formalize this activity. You know, people are doing it on their own. Remember grassroots or jugaad, just improvisation, cutting corners. Well, why don't we package this into a much more formalized offering and sell it to everyone else? So they started a company called Arbutus Medical, and their main and what they came up with was this fully sealed cover, which is made out of professional material, and this adapter unit which this allows for any microbial exchange from the drill. And they have a proper procedure by which, you know, you use an unsterile nurse. I mean, I've got pictures and videos of us doing this in Uganda and Kenya. But it's an amazing piece of kit. I mean, it's a no-brainer. And actually, this practice of covering devices in surgery or in the operating theater is not uncommon. You know, they do it on ultrasound probes, they do it on other things, and it's often a disposable sleeve. They'll put it on, they'll use the device and throw it away. But why haven't they been doing that commonsensically for this thing, which was like 30,000 pounds? So we basically said, can we introduce this into the NHS? So over the last 2 years, we've been struggling to get this into the NHS, despite the fact that the NHS has been given this target of saving 22 billion pounds by 2020. And there is no documentation whatsoever today in 2018 that we're even anywhere close to achieving that objective. And since 2 years, we're saying, well, we can help you make a small dent towards that. So orthopedic or musculoskeletal disorder is like almost 10% of hospital admissions in the UK. It's a big chunk of, you know, the expenditure, 5 billion pounds back in 2014. And a lot of that has to do with the cost of these drills. You can imagine. So we did an economic business model using our frameworks and toolkits. And we said, okay, if the NHS were to replace all their incumbent surgical drills with equivalent ones, it cost them 115 million pounds. If they went with Frugal innovation, it only cost them 7.5 million pounds. And that's 94% saving. And that's the kind of saving that Prahalad talks about in his 2006 book about bottom of the pyramid innovation. You know, that if you want to genuinely serve the needs of the underserved in low-income developing countries, then you have to be at least 90% cheaper than the existing. So I thought that that was amazing that almost a decade later, we have evidence of those kinds of numbers that Prahalad talked about. So we're still struggling to get this introduced. It's not easy. And you know, as Albert Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But that's what the NHS is, right? There's a lot of talk about change and improvement and efficiency and meeting our budget deficit. Sorry.
No, I agree with you. Absolutely.
But and our main message, again, through our other studies that we've done, surveys, is that look, you really need to give your clinicians, frontline workers, flexibility and time and space to adopt and learn new ways of doing things. And learn these things from unexpected places, like Uganda, like Kenya, like Malawi, because that's where some of these more promising stuff is coming from. But again, our other piece of research shows us that there's lots of cognitive biases that are obstructive. You know, when we think about You know, and just imagine you go to a clinician who's very acknowledged and respected. And you go to him with a device and you say, this was actually designed at Mulago Hospital in Uganda. That's exactly the reaction we got. Like, do you expect us to use this here in the NHS? No, we cannot do that. But I could show you all the specifications the company has met. And the first impression, as they say, is unfortunately the lasting impression. That's the So it's a challenge for us, and for all of you as well, on bringing back these learnings to the rest of the world.
Thank you.
I'll ask that if we have any questions, we'll ask during the coffee break, since we're slightly.
We've got discussants Anne-Marie for this paper. I don't know how to do this.
Well, I will just ask one question, because I was asked to be the discussant, so I've read some of Yasser's work. So just to kind of help to focus the questions, because I know everyone will have loads of questions, but I'm going to focus on one. And in your tech, and it's in and around. I want to go back to the knee and the toilet story, which I thought was very well illustrated here. So in your text as well, you talk about the social entrepreneurs or the frugal innovators being very interested in institutional as well as social change, and as you're saying, not necessarily the technology. And in a way, what I'm getting from that is that there's an impetus to assemble the world in which the innovation will exist, and then bring about the kind of changes that you imagine. So I think I'm very interested in this sort of shaping of the world in which the innovations will live, because and in a way I'm kind of beginning to think that rather than frugal innovation, we should be talking about good and bad innovation, because the original prosthetic knee was bad innovation. In a sense, it required the world in which that prosthetic knee would live to make up for the deficiencies in the technology. Whereas the second round of the design took more into account the world in which the person using the knee would live, and it required less effort less changes from the world. The user could continue to live in their world, the technology changed. So I think that's quite interesting, because what would you say to that, in a sense of whether we should be talking about good and bad innovation, and the frugal innovation kind of maybe complicates things? The idea that there's a requirement to take the world into account, rather than just focusing on the technology or the process change that you're going through.
Right. Well, I mean, the point about and welcome for anybody else to feed into this discussion, but about changing the world, I think it resonates with the discussion we had yesterday about there's been lots of innovations that come about, but you need the right thing at the right place with the right people at the right time. And some innovations just tend to not be successful because one or other parts of those things are not present. So for some of these innovations, yes, they needed to go out and bring awareness and set the stage for the introduction of that innovation, like the banana pads, as I mentioned. But with the prosthetic knee joint, that's slightly different, I agree, because the need was already very well established and very urgent as well. And so maybe they didn't have the expertise or the human resource, the skills to be able to provide a solution for that particular need. And that's why they invited the Stanford-based engineers to give them a different perspective. So it was a little bit easier, as it was much more focused on just the technological side.
But okay, I'll come on to that again, because actually the point I think would be useful to discuss is because when you're building this world that I'm talking about, there's a tendency to think about it only in advocacy. We tend to think that, I'm wondering whether we could get too focused on we have to change mindsets or we have to change culture, and once we change that, then everything else will follow. Whereas actually the world in which these innovations can succeed in bringing about the changes that they wish to make already has to make adjustments, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So adjustments that are not only cultural, I think there's an element of institutional and policy. So for instance, is it about coming up with a different tax regime for sanitary pads in that, so that they're taxed differently? Is it is it the business model about, in the sense, who pays? And those things are actually really important because I'm concerned that we just focus on, we have this amazing product that's going to change the world, and all we have to do is to advocate people to change their mindset and everything will fall into place. Whereas I think it's a little bit more, there's more of a network and a dialectic going on. There's more actors at play. There's more elements where we can unlock, the route through which the innovation.
Absolutely right. I mean, what comes to my mind what Jaideep was saying yesterday about the introduction of M-Pesa in Kenya. Institutionally, you would have thought that would have never succeeded, because the regulator would have said, no, you are trying to be a bank, whereas you're a telecommunications company. And there's been different models of mobile, around the world. One is the bank-led, one is the telecom-led, where like M-Pesa. But then there are other ones which are more bank-led, such as in India, where you as a telecom can be an intermediary or a channel of exchange, but the funds really have to be controlled by the banks who have a license to do so. And then there are hybrid models. So those are the different kinds of institutional innovations and regulatory regimes that different countries are trying in that part. That's it.
To open it up, I mean, I had other questions, obviously, but I prefer if it's a more responding to talk about.
Any other?
Yeah, what was one of the interesting things I picked up, Yasser, was that when this opportunity or this niche time comes for an innovation, people always seem to go to places like Stanford. So I think
we went to Santa Clara as well.
Yeah, well, right.
So we're a little bit more equitable in that sense.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just wondering, because I do actually think, again, I know the Ugandan context better than other countries, but I know that there are people in Makerere University who could have developed that need. I mean, so I just wonder about that issue about co-researching and and the other question I wanted to raise was we have a project in Uganda now on capacity building in prosthetics, and we made some prosthetic arms last year for a lady who'd had both her arms hacked off in a domestic violence attack, and we did that through a student placement from Salford University. And we were so kind of pleased, and the BBC got it, and it went all over the world. The honest truth is, when our colleagues went out a couple of weeks ago, that lady isn't using her arms. So that just really supports your issue about, and so you might have a situation where people have no prostheses, other people have got like 5 sets because all these NGOs come in and give them the same people, multiple sets of prostheses. So I think I'm saying that really to re-emphasise your point about the importance of users and trying to find out what it is they want. Because we could give people very functional prostheses, like a metal gripper, but they didn't want that. It was the cosmetic side of it. So involving users, and also that just to really emphasise that the migration of explicit knowledge, like a mechanical knee or whatever, has to go hand in hand with the kind of implicit knowledge and contextualisation that, as you were saying, makes that process effective.
Yeah, the other point that I was thinking about, because it's going to come up with the guys with their case studies, and you had your case studies as well. Because it's a genuine question of mine that when we all know, and you very much pick out in your book, how important context is, and how, that these sort of innovations and their success, and I suppose are kind of contingent on a number of local factors. When we know that contingent and that local factor is so significant in the success of the innovation, what are we trying to do when we compare and contrast across case studies, across different settings? What's the goal? And I suppose because you very much, you're using, you're deploying models in different contexts. So would you agree that even though your model ostensibly looks the same, that it is very much changed when it's put to use? So that we do have models that allow us to compare, but once they're put to use or localized, they do differ in practice.
Yeah, I'm hoping that will happen.
Yeah.
Certainly, when people pick up on these and extend them and mold them for their particular purpose. But as you've seen with the case, we're talking about case studies, but that's the issue. Narayana's been talked about, as I said, bleeding to death. But we've studied Narayana lately in terms of their project in the Cayman Islands to replicate it there. Not happening. I mean, it's just not happening to the same level that they are successful in their home context. So
that's where I'm thinking that if we had a better appreciation of, it's a very generic term, but the world in which the technology or the innovation needs to exist.
yes.
If we are more understanding of the network or the actor network that surrounds the particular innovation, including the technology and other supporting devices and cultures and so on, then they may become slightly more mobile.
Yeah.
Or at least we acknowledge that in moving them from one context to another, that the actor network will change, but we're attentive to it
Yes.
and not just the...
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we are hoping we can help facilitate, to be able to draw and learn from innovations from other contexts and make them useful to ourselves or others who may need it. But in actuality, one argument that you could make is how many examples of frugal innovations can you genuinely narrate that have diffused from one context to another? Is it that these frugal innovations are so embedded in their local context that that's why we think they're different? That's why we look up to them.
Yeah.
If they were so commonplace, then I don't think we'd be even talking about them. Might be a limitation, I don't know.
Or just a characteristic
Of the frugal innovation.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Many comments, but I want to have a discussion.
Coffee will be at 11 o'clock.
11, okay.
Yeah. I might go and check if it will be a bit earlier, but then we could progress on with the discussion.
We have our case from yesterday, is it?
Yeah, and we have the presentations as well, so we'll see. Maybe we'll start on that.
Thank you once again.
Actually, in some ways that might not be the most interesting for you. The first bit, which is that one is more focused on when we send people out to Uganda, doctors, what knowledge they bring back here.